The offer didn't come with threats. It didn't come with guns or raised voices. It arrived quietly, wrapped in numbers that made sense on paper. Protection money, stability, a guarantee that business would flow smoothly if the right hands were paid. In most neighborhoods, that kind of proposal ended the conversation before it began. Money talks, and usually it wins. But Harlem wasn't most neighborhoods. At the center of that conversation stood Bumpy Johnson, a man who understood money better than the men offering it. He knew what protection payments really were, not security, but ownership. Once you accept the money, you accept the leash. And once the leash is on, every decision stops being yours. That wasn't a personal risk, it was a community one. What made the offer dangerous wasn't the amount, it was how reasonable it sounded. No violence, no disruption, just a clean arrangement that would benefit everyone involved. That's how control is sold when brute force would cost too much. You don't invade, you invest. You don't threaten, you normalize dependence. Bumpy listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't argue the numbers, because the numbers were never the issue. Harlem had survived worse than financial pressure. What it couldn't survive was being reduced to a line item on someone else's ledger. His answer wasn't dramatic. It didn't humiliate anyone in the room, but it drew a boundary money couldn't cross. A refusal rooted not in pride, but in something rarer dignity. The understanding that once a neighborhood is bought, it never truly belongs to itself again. That moment wouldn't make headlines. No shots were fired, no bodies fell, but the consequences would ripple through balance sheets, routes, and revenues. Because when Harlem said no, it didn't just reject an offer, it made a statement. And that statement would end up costing the mob millions. On the surface, protection money looks like a transaction. Cash changes hands, and in return, trouble stays away. That's how it's explained, and that's how it's sold. But in reality, protection payments are never about safety. They're about control. The moment money is accepted, authority quietly shifts from the person running the neighborhood to the people financing it. That's why the offer made to Bumpy Johnson carried far more weight than its numbers suggested. This wasn't about guarding a few businesses or smoothing out disputes. It was about inserting an external power structure into Harlem and letting it take root. Protection money doesn't stop problems. It decides who's allowed to create them. The genius of the system is how harmless it appears. There are no visible takeovers, no sudden changes in leadership. Everything keeps running just under new terms. Decisions start to require approval. Routes get adjusted, priorities shift, and slowly, the neighborhood stops being self-governing. It becomes a franchise. For organized crime, this model was efficient. Buying cooperation was cheaper than enforcing it. Once payments started, resistance became irrational. Why fight a system that works? That's the illusion. The real cost only becomes visible later, when every option carries a price tag and every refusal comes with consequences. Harlem, however, wasn't a blank slate. It had its own systems, its own rules, and its own memory of what happened when outside interests claimed to know what was best for it. Accepting protection money wouldn't have solved a problem. It would have rewritten the neighborhood's future. That's what made the decision so stark. Turning the offer down wasn't about rejecting cash. It was about refusing a structure designed to outlast any single payment. Once protection money enters a community, it rarely leaves. It just changes hands. By the time the offer was on the table, the real question wasn't how much was being offered. It was who Harlem would belong to afterward. The approach was deliberate. No muscle, no intimidation, no sudden pressure meant to provoke a reaction. The men who carried the offer understood optics, and they understood Harlem. This wasn't a place you stormed into. It was a place you entered carefully, speaking the language of reason. Protection money was presented not as dominance, but as partnership. The pitch was simple. Business would be easier. Conflicts would disappear before they started. Outside interference would be handled quietly, all of it framed as efficiency. This wasn't about taking over, it was about helping. That's how power learns to disguise itself when force would attract too much attention. What made the offer dangerous was how respectful it sounded. There was no demand for loyalty, no insult to pride, just numbers, logistics, and a promise that nothing would fundamentally change. That was the lie hidden in plain sight. Because the moment money like this is accepted, everything changes just slowly enough that it feels natural. For the men making the offer, this was standard procedure. Buy stability instead of enforcing it, reduce volatility, turn unpredictable territory into a managed asset. Harlem wasn't being threatened. It was being evaluated, its value calculated, its resistance priced in, and they assumed it would work. They assumed that anyone smart enough to survive Harlem was smart enough to take guaranteed money. They assumed pragmatism would override principle. After all, refusing protection money made no financial sense. It exposed everyone involved to unnecessary risk, at least on paper. But paper has limits. Bumpy Johnson listened without reacting, because reaction was what the offer depended on. Anger would open negotiation. Fear would justify compromise. Even curiosity would suggest flexibility. Instead, he treated the proposal like a thought experiment that had already failed. The men across from him believed they were offering security. What they were really offering was influence, layered carefully so it wouldn't feel like surrender. And for the first time in that room, it became clear that the conversation wasn't about whether the offer was generous enough. It was about whether Harlem could be priced at all. The refusal didn't come with a speech. There was no lecture about pride, no warning about consequences. Bumpy Johnson didn't challenge the men across from him, because challenging them would have elevated the offer into a contest, and this was never a contest. It was a boundary. He acknowledged the logic. He understood the efficiency. He didn't dispute the math. That was the most disarming part. By agreeing with everything except the conclusion, he removed the ground they expected to stand on. There was nothing to negotiate because the refusal wasn't rooted in emotion or fear. It was rooted in principle, delivered calmly enough to make it unmistakable. The answer wasn't no in the way people expect no to sound. It was closer to "this doesn't apply here." Harlem didn't need protection because it wasn't available for purchase. Not from outsiders, not at any price. Accepting the money would have been easier in the short term. It would have smoothed relationships, reduced pressure, and created the illusion of peace. But peace built on ownership isn't peace. It's a lease. What made the refusal costly wasn't its defiance, but its clarity. There was no room left to reframe the offer, no angle to adjust the numbers. The message was clean. If you want influence here, it won't be bought. And if it can't be bought, it has to be earned slowly, indirectly, and without guarantees. That kind of answer forces recalculation. It turns a straightforward investment into a risk. The men who came to offer protection weren't insulted, but they were unsettled. They had expected resistance they could wear down. What they encountered instead was a line they couldn't step over without changing the nature of the relationship entirely. By refusing politely, Bumpy denied them escalation. By refusing decisively, he denied them leverage. There was no insult to avenge, no threat to respond to, no public slight that demanded correction. Just a closed door that stayed closed because it had never been opened. In the world of organized power, that's the most expensive kind of answer. Not one that provokes retaliation, but one that makes future profits uncertain. The offer was finished the moment it was declined, and with it, the assumption that Harlem could be folded neatly into someone else's system. The money stayed on the table. The control did not. The impact wasn't immediate, and that was the point. No retaliation followed the refusal, no warnings were sent, no lines were crossed. On the surface, business continued as usual. But beneath that calm, The math began to shift slowly, deliberately, and always against the people who had made the offer. Without Harlem's cooperation, routes became inefficient. Operations that depended on smooth passage through the neighborhood now required detours, intermediaries, and extra layers of insulation. Each workaround added cost. Each added cost cut margins. What had once been projected as easy, stable revenue turned into a ledger full of friction. This was the quiet side of organized power, where losses don't come from violence, but from delay. Deals took longer to close. Trust had to be bought twice. Payments increased to compensate for uncertainty. The same structure that had worked elsewhere failed to lock in here, and failure in one node spreads quickly across a network. For the mob, this wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a signal. Harlem wouldn't absorb external control the way other territories had. Without acceptance at the local level, even the most disciplined operations leaked money. And leaks add up. What was meant to be protection income turned into maintenance expense. Bumpy Johnson didn't need to apply pressure. He didn't have to organize resistance or sabotage anyone's interests. By refusing to participate, he forced the system to work without him, and that was far more expensive than opposition. Cooperation is cheap. Independence is not. Over time, the cost became impossible to ignore, not because of a single loss, but because of cumulative inefficiency. Millions didn't vanish overnight. They bled out through inefficiency, redundancy, and missed opportunity. Every dollar lost traced back to the same moment, the offer that had been declined without drama. This was the real consequence of saying no. Not chaos, not conflict, but the slow realization that some communities couldn't be monetized the way others could. Harlem wasn't hostile territory. It was something worse for outside interests, unbuyable. And in the economics of organized power, that's a position few systems are built to tolerate. The refusal eventually became more than a single decision. It hardened into a precedent. Word traveled, not through announcements or warnings, but through behavior. Deals stalled. Assumptions were adjusted. The message settled in quietly. Money worked differently in Harlem. What made this dangerous for outside interests wasn't hostility, it was consistency. Bumpy Johnson didn't reject one offer and entertain the next. There was no back channel, no private exception, no alternate arrangement waiting in the shadows. That kind of discipline is rare, and it's expensive for anyone trying to apply leverage. Harlem wasn't closed, it wasn't isolated, but it operated on its own terms. That distinction mattered. You could do business there, but you couldn't buy authority. You could move through it, but you couldn't own it. And that blurred line is where a lot of money gets lost. For the mob, this meant recalibration. Strategies that depended on predictable compliance failed. Forecasts became unreliable. Even when deals were possible, they came with uncertainty that had to be priced in. And when uncertainty becomes permanent, investment dries up. Capital looks for places where control is cheaper. The most telling part was what didn't happen. There was no showdown meant to reassert dominance, no public lesson designed to intimidate. The cost of forcing the issue was too high, and the reward too uncertain. Harlem wasn't worth breaking the system over, and that admission carried its own price. This is where dignity turns into leverage. Not because it's loud, but because it's stable. By refusing to convert autonomy into income, Harlem preserved something harder to replace than cash, the ability to decide its own limits. Money is powerful because it adapts. It finds openings. It negotiates. But it depends on willingness. And when willingness disappears, money loses its edge. That was the final calculation. Harlem didn't need to declare itself off the market. It simply acted like it had never been for sale. And in doing so, it taught a costly lesson to anyone who believed every neighborhood had a price. No headlines followed the refusal. There were no dramatic confrontations, no sudden collapse that demanded explanation. On the surface, nothing seemed to change. But in the balance sheets and planning rooms of organized power, the consequences were unmistakable. Money that was supposed to move easily didn't. Profits that had been forecast with confidence slowly evaporated, and all of it traced back to a single decision that couldn't be bought away. What made this moment enduring wasn't defiance, it was restraint. Bumpy Johnson didn't reject the offer to prove a point. He rejected it to protect something that never appears on a ledger: autonomy. Harlem's value wasn't in how much revenue it could generate for outsiders, but in how firmly it controlled its own terms. This story matters because it challenges the most basic assumption of power, that everything has a price. In many places, that assumption holds. Money reshapes relationships, rewrites rules, and outlasts principles. But occasionally, it runs into a boundary it can't cross. Not because force stops it, but because cooperation is withdrawn. There were no winners in the traditional sense, no territory conquered, no rival eliminated, just a system forced to accept inefficiency where it expected profit. And in organized crime, inefficiency is a quiet form of defeat. Harlem didn't celebrate the decision. It didn't need to. The absence of control was victory enough. By refusing protection money, the neighborhood avoided a transaction that would have paid well in the short term and cost everything in the long run. In the end, this wasn't a story about money lost. It was about dignity preserved, and that's the kind of asset no amount of protection can replace.